I never imagined my 72nd birthday would end with flashing blue lights and hollow silence. The moment I saw the police officers standing solemnly at my front gate, clutching an envelope in hand, my heart shattered in ways words can hardly capture. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The morning started like any other in my cramped Queens apartment. The familiar hum of the subway rattled beneath my feet, a constant reminder of the city that never sleeps while I barely rest. The scent of stale coffee mixed with the faint aroma of my struggling flower pots on the balcony, marigolds that had seen better days, their petals curling like my own hope. I know these details by heart, every crack in the ceiling, every squeaky floorboard, yet they no longer comfort me. They mock me with their sameness, their indifference to my pain. My knees ache as I shuffle to the kitchen each morning. 72 years of carrying everyone's burdens have left their marks on my joints, stiff from years of neglect and a loneliness so deep it has settled into my bones. The photographs on the wall, faded and curling at the edges, seem to watch me with silent accusations. There's Robert, my late husband, smiling in his work clothes outside our old Brooklyn apartment. There are the children I raised with love beyond measure, Michael, my firstborn, serious even as a boy, and Sarah, my daughter with her father's stubborn chin and my own desperate need to please. But lately, the silence has become deafening. Like this morning, my 72nd birthday morning, when I found my phone empty of messages, my texts floating in digital space, ignored. Sarah had cancelled our birthday brunch yesterday with a casual text, "Sorry mom, something came up with the kids." Something always came up when it involved me. I imagined laughter around restaurant tables, stories being shared over mimosas and eggs Benedict, and somehow, I wasn't invited to my own celebration. The disappointment pierced deeply, another small cut layered over decades of accumulated wounds. I remember standing at my kitchen window that morning, looking down at the street where children played hopscotch on the sidewalk. Their laughter drifted up 4 stories, bright and carefree. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and wondered when I had stopped laughing like that. When had joy become such a stranger in my life? You know, I used to believe that love was enough. That if you gave everything, your time, your money, your very soul, to your family, they would cherish you in return. I was wrong. So very wrong. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the history of sacrifices that paved this painful road. I refused to let bitterness take root entirely, because everything I had, every meal on their plates, every bandage on their wounds, every dream I abandoned, it was all because of them. I remember those early years in Brooklyn with startling clarity, as if yesterday's rain still clings to my skin. I would wake at 4:30 in the morning to prepare lunches for Robert before his construction job, meals that would sustain him through 12-hour days building other people's dreams while our own remained sketched in pencil, easily erased. Michael was barely walking then, tottering around our cramped apartment with the fearless confidence only children possess. Sarah was still aflutter in my belly, making her presence known with kicks that reminded me the future was coming whether we were ready or not. Money was always tight. Robert's paycheck covered rent and utilities, but barely. I took on sewing work, hemming dresses and mending tears for neighbors who paid me in crumpled dollar bills and grateful smiles. My fingers would bleed from the needle pricks, tiny red dots on fabric that someone else would wear to occasions I could never afford to attend. But I didn't complain. We were building something, a life, a family, a foundation that would last. When Michael started school, the demands multiplied. "Mom, I need money for the field trip." "Mom, can you buy me new sneakers?" "The kids are teasing me." Each request tugged at my heart with invisible strings. How could I deny him the childhood I never had? I worked extra shifts at the diner where I'd found evening work, serving coffee and pie to strangers while my own children ate sandwiches alone at home. The pattern started early, you see. Give until it hurts, then give some more. When Sarah entered high school and wanted to join the drama club, I found the $40 for costumes by skipping my own meals for a week. When Michael broke his arm playing basketball, I paid the hospital bills by selling my mother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry I'd ever owned that meant something. "You're the best mom in the world," Michael would say, hugging me tight after I'd solved whatever crisis had befallen him. Those words sustained me through the exhaustion, through the ache in my feet from standing all day, through the worry that kept me awake counting bills in my head. I lived for their smiles, their gratitude, their need for me. But somewhere along the way, gratitude transformed into expectation. Love became transaction. Need became demand. I remember the night everything shifted, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Michael was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in business that I'd helped pay for by taking out loans against our house. He called me at 11 p.m., his voice thick with tears. "Mom, I messed up. I invested some money in stocks, thinking I could make a quick profit, but I lost everything. Can you help with my rent?" My heart broke for him. My successful, ambitious son had made a mistake, and of course I would catch him when he fell. Without hesitation, I went to the bank the next morning and withdrew $600 from my savings, money I'd been putting aside for years, hoping someday Robert and I might take that trip to Florida we'd always dreamed about. "Thank you, Mom. I'll pay you back as soon as I get on my feet." He never did pay me back. More concerning, he never stopped asking. The requests became monthly rituals, then weekly expectations. 500 here, 200 there, always with promises of repayment that evaporated like morning mist. When I gently brought up the growing debt, his face would cloud with hurt. "I can't believe you're keeping track, Mom. I thought family helped each other without keeping score." The guilt would wash over me in waves. He was right, wasn't he? Family shouldn't be about ledger books and IOUs. So I stopped mentioning the money and started working overtime at the diner, my tips disappearing into his apartment rent, his car payments, his lifestyle that somehow required more funding than my entire monthly budget. Sarah's demands were more subtle but equally draining. She'd married young to a man who worked sporadically, and when their first child arrived, she needed help with daycare costs. Then came the second baby, and the third, and suddenly I was not just grandmother but primary financial support for a family of 5. My own grocery budget shrank to accommodate their needs. I'd stand in the cereal aisle at the supermarket, calculator in hand, choosing the store brand everything so I could afford to keep sending money to Sarah. "Mom, you're a lifesaver," she'd say during our brief phone calls, usually made while she was driving between errands, her voice distracted. "I don't know what we'd do without you. But I did know what they'd do without me. They'd figure it out. They'd make different choices, sacrifices of their own, budgets that actually balanced. Instead, I became their safety net, their bank, their solution to every financial problem. And eventually, their expected source of support. The pattern crystallized during Robert's illness. He'd developed diabetes in his 60s, a condition that required expensive medication and frequent doctor visits. Our health insurance covered some costs, but far from all. I found myself working 3 jobs, the diner, weekend housekeeping for wealthy families in Manhattan, and still taking in alterations work in the evenings. I was exhausted beyond words, running on coffee and determination, when Michael called with what he described as an investment opportunity. A friend of his had discovered cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, and there was money to be made if you got in early. All he needed was $5,000 to start building what could become a vast fortune. "Think about it, Mom. This could set us all up for life. You'd never have to worry about money again." $5,000. I stared at that number on the piece of paper where I'd written it down. It represented months of work, years of saving, the entirety of my emergency fund. But the promise was tantalizing. Financial security for all of us. No more scrambling to pay bills, no more choosing between medication and groceries. I gave him the money. The Bitcoin investment, like so many of his ventures, evaporated into digital nothingness. The market crashed, he explained with a shrug, as if losing my life savings was merely bad luck rather than terrible judgment. "That's just how investing works, Mom. You win some, you lose some." But I had lost everything, and he seemed to have lost nothing but my money. It was around this time that the silences began. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. When I did see my children, conversations felt strained, obligatory. They spoke about their lives, their friends, their problems, but showed little interest in mine. If I mentioned feeling tired or worried about money, their attention would drift. Eyes would glance at phones, subjects would change, excuses would materialize. "Mom, you worry too much," Sarah would say dismissively. "Everything always works out." Easy words from someone whose rent I was paying. The silences grew longer as I aged. Birthdays became hollow rituals marked by rushed phone calls and generic cards. When I turned 70, I'd hoped my children might organize a small celebration, perhaps dinner at that Italian restaurant in Little Italy where we'd celebrated Sarah's engagement years before. Instead, I received 2 text messages, one from Michael saying, "Happy birthday, Mom," and another from Sarah apologizing for being busy but promising to call later. She never did call. I spent that birthday alone, eating takeout Chinese food while watching old movies on television. The apartment felt enormous in its emptiness, every shadow a reminder of the family gatherings that existed only in my memory. I went to bed early, telling myself that birthdays mattered less at my age, that I was being silly for expecting more. But expectations, once disappointed, have a way of withering. Hope, once crushed, struggles to regrow. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult winter when I contracted the flu. For 3 days, I lay in bed with a fever that made the room spin and a cough that felt like broken glass in my chest. I called Michael first, hoping he might bring me some soup or just sit with me for an hour. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, this is Michael. Leave a message." I did leave a message, explaining that I was sick and could use some help. He didn't call back. I tried Sarah next, with similar results. Finally, desperately, I sent text messages to both of them. I'm very ill and alone. Could one of you please check on me? Michael's response came 12 hours later. Sorry mom, crazy busy at work. Hope you feel better soon. Sarah's arrived the following day. Oh no. I'm dealing with the kids' school stuff. Can you call if it's an emergency? An emergency. I wondered what qualified as an emergency in their minds. Was dying alone in my apartment dramatic enough to warrant their attention? Or would that, too, be an inconvenience they'd handle with a phone call to 911 and an apology for not being available? I recovered from the flu on my own, sustained by canned soup and the kindness of Mrs. Rodriguez, the building superintendent's wife, who checked on me when she noticed my newspapers piling up outside my door. We barely knew each other, yet she showed more concern for my well-being in one day than my own children had in months. It was after that illness that I began to see the pattern clearly, like focusing a lens until the blurry image sharpens into painful clarity. I was useful to my children when they needed money or favors, invisible to them otherwise. Our relationships had become transactional. I gave, they took, and everyone pretended this arrangement was normal, healthy, loving. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. First came the small observations, how conversations always seemed to steer toward their needs, their problems, their requests for help. Then came the larger patterns, how visits coincided with financial difficulties, how phone calls preceded requests for loans, how my value seemed directly proportional to my ability to solve their problems with my checkbook. I started keeping track, not out of spite but out of a growing need to understand what our relationships had become. In a small notebook, I recorded every financial transaction, every request, every promise to pay me back. The numbers told a story I'd been refusing to read. Over 15 years, I had given my children nearly $60,000. Money from my pension, my savings, my social security payments, my part-time work at the local library where I'd taken a job to supplement my income. $60,000. The number sat heavy in my chest like a stone. That money could have secured my own future, paid for the retirement I'd imagined but never planned for because I was too busy funding their present. It could have repaired my apartment's leaky roof, replaced the ancient refrigerator that wheezed through the night, covered the dental work I'd been postponing for 3 years. Instead, it had disappeared into their lives like water into sand, leaving no trace except my growing financial insecurity. And still, they asked for more. But money was only part of the equation. The emotional cost was harder to quantify but far more devastating. I had spent decades centering my life around their needs, their schedules, their crises. My own interests, friendships, dreams had been pushed aside to make room for their urgency. I couldn't remember the last time I'd read a book for pleasure, seen a movie I wanted to see, or took a walk just for the joy of walking. My world had shrunk to the size of their needs, and somehow, I had disappeared from the center of my own life. The microaggressions were perhaps the most insidious part of this slow erosion. They came disguised as jokes, observations, casual comments that left small wounds I barely noticed until they accumulated into something unbearable. "Mom, you're so dramatic," Sarah would say when I expressed hurt at being forgotten or ignored. "You take everything so personally. You need to stop being so needy," Michael would add, his tone patient but condescending, as if my desire for connection was a character flaw requiring correction. They had a gift for making their neglect seem like my fault, their absence feel like my inadequacy. When they forgot my birthday, it was because I made such a big deal about these things. When they failed to return calls, it was because I was too sensitive about communication. When they asked for money after months of silence, any hesitation on my part was met with hurt feelings and gentle manipulation. "I thought I could count on you, Mom," became a phrase that preceded every request, implying that my love was measured by my willingness to give without question or condition. The loneliness grew roots in those empty spaces between conversations, in the silence after phone calls that ended abruptly, in the hours spent wondering if my children were okay while knowing they weren't wondering the same about me. I would sit by my window watching the street below, observing other families walking together, laughing together, choosing to spend time in each other's company not because they needed something but because they enjoyed it. When was the last time one of my children had called just to chat? When had we last shared a meal that wasn't interrupted by their phones, their partners, their pressing obligations elsewhere? I couldn't remember, and that forgetting felt like another small death. The breaking point should have been dramatic, but it wasn't. It was quiet, almost mundane in its simplicity. I had been battling a persistent worry about my monthly expenses. The rent had increased, the cost of prescription medications had doubled, and my part-time library salary couldn't bridge the growing gap between income and survival. I spent a sleepless night calculating and recalculating my budget, trying to find places to cut costs that didn't exist. I'd already eliminated everything non-essential: cable television, restaurant meals, new clothes, any entertainment that required payment. I was living on rice and beans, wearing shoes with holes, postponing medical appointments I couldn't afford. In the morning, exhausted from worry, I made a decision I'd never made before. I called Michael and explained my financial situation honestly, without dramatic emphasis or emotional manipulation. I simply stated the facts: my expenses exceeded my income, I had no emergency fund left, and I needed help. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "we all have money problems. You can't expect us to solve yours." The irony was breathtaking. This from a son to whom I'd given thousands of dollars over the years, whose rent I'd paid, whose investments I'd funded, whose emergencies had become my responsibility. Now that I had an emergency, suddenly money problems were individual responsibilities. "I understand," I said quietly. "I just thought, you thought you could guilt trip me into giving you money," he interrupted. "That's not fair, Mom. We have our own families to think about." I hung up without responding and sat staring at the phone for a long time. Something had shifted inside me, a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of my consciousness. For the first time in decades, I saw our relationship clearly, without the soft focus of motherly love to blur the harsh edges. I was not their mother in any meaningful sense beyond biology. I was their bank account, their safety net, their solution to problems they should have solved themselves. And when I needed them, really needed them, they were nowhere to be found. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked in the mirror, really looked, not just the quick glances while brushing my teeth or combing my hair. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes dulled by exhaustion, her posture curved inward as if protecting herself from invisible blows. This was what $60,000 and 30 years of emotional availability had bought me: a reflection I didn't recognize, a life I didn't want, relationships that sustained everyone but me. I went to bed that night with a decision crystallizing in my mind like ice forming on a winter pond. Something had to change, even if that something was everything. But change, I discovered, comes in waves rather than single moments. The next morning brought doubt, guilt, the familiar voice in my head that whispered about ungrateful children and selfish mothers. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe I was being dramatic, needy, unrealistic in my expectations. Maybe this was just what family looked like in the modern world: busy, distracted, focused on individual survival rather than collective care. I spent the day second-guessing myself, as I had trained myself to do over years of being told my feelings were wrong, my needs excessive, my expectations unreasonable. By evening, I had almost convinced myself to apologize, to take back my request for help and return to the familiar pattern of giving without receiving. Then Sarah called. "Mom, I heard you talk to Michael about money." Her voice carried that particular tone of disappointment I'd learned to dread. "I can't believe you'd try to make us feel guilty like that." "I wasn't trying to make anyone feel guilty," I said carefully. "I was asking for help. But you know we don't have extra money right now. Things are tight for everyone." She paused, and I could hear children arguing in the background. "Look, maybe if you managed your finances better, you wouldn't need to depend on us." Depend on them. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. According to Sarah's logic, my decades of financial support to them meant nothing, created no reciprocal obligation, established no foundation of mutual care. I had been depending on them by asking for help once, while they had been simply accepting what was offered when they asked repeatedly. "Sarah," I said slowly, "over the past 5 years, I've given you more than $20,000. I think asking for help when I need it is reasonable." The silence that followed was arctic. When she spoke again, her voice had hardened into something I'd never heard before. "We never asked you to keep track like that. Family doesn't keep score, Mom. What you gave us was given freely, out of love. You can't use it against us now." Out of love. She was right about that part. Everything I'd given had been offered with love, without conditions, without expectations of return. But love, I was learning, could be a weapon used against the person who wielded it. My acts of love had become evidence of my supposed obligation to continue giving, while their acceptance of that love apparently created no obligation to reciprocate. After Sarah hung up, abruptly, claiming one of her children needed her attention, I sat in my quiet apartment with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The familiar weight of guilt pressed down on my shoulders, but underneath it, something new was stirring. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something harder to name but impossible to ignore. Self-preservation, maybe. The recognition that I was drowning in relationships that demanded everything from me while offering nothing in return. The understanding that if I didn't start valuing myself, no one else would either. That night, I took out the small notebook where I'd been recording financial transactions and added a new column: emotional costs. Not to keep score, as Sarah accused, but to fully comprehend what these relationships were costing me. The missed opportunities to build friendships because I was always available for their crises. The hobbies abandoned because their needs took precedence. The dreams deferred and ultimately discarded because their immediate wants seemed more important than my long-term well-being. The list was longer than I expected and more painful to write. But seeing it there, documented in my careful handwriting, made something real that had previously been invisible. I had been paying for their love with my own life, and the exchange rate was bankrupting me. As spring turned toward summer, I began making small changes. I stopped answering every phone call immediately, letting some go to voicemail so I could choose when and how to respond. I stopped saying yes automatically to every request, instead asking for time to think about it. I started spending some of my limited income on myself, a book here, a coffee there, small rebellions against the austerity I'd imposed to fund their lifestyles. These changes felt enormous to me but apparently went unnoticed by my children, whose communications remained focused on their own needs and concerns. When Michael called in June to ask for money to repair his car, he seemed genuinely surprised when I said I'd need to check my budget first. "Since when do you need to check your budget?" he asked, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "It's only $500. Only $500. As if that amount was insignificant, as if my financial resources were infinite, as if my ability to pay should be taken for granted. I explained that my expenses had increased and my income hadn't, that $500 was actually a significant amount for someone living on a fixed income. "Fine," he said with the tone of someone doing me a favor. "I'll ask Dad." But Robert, whose health had been declining for months, had his own financial limitations. His medical expenses were mounting, and his pension barely covered his own needs. When Michael's request was refused there as well, he called me back. "I guess I'll have to figure something else out," he said, his voice heavy with martyrdom. "I just thought family was supposed to help each other. Family was supposed to help each other." The phrase echoed in my head for days afterward. If that were true, where was the family when I needed help? If mutual support was the foundation of our relationships, why did the support flow in only one direction? I began to wonder if my children actually loved me or simply loved what I provided. Would they miss me if I were gone, or would they miss my checkbook? The question was too painful to answer directly, but their behavior suggested possibilities I wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. My 71st birthday came and went with even less fanfare than the previous year. A card from Sarah arrived 3 days late, and Michael called while he was clearly distracted by other activities. No one suggested celebrating together. No one offered to take me to dinner or even share a phone call longer than 5 minutes. I spent that birthday reorganizing old photographs, looking at images of family gatherings that felt like evidence of a life I'd imagined rather than lived. There were pictures from holidays, birthdays, graduations, all events where I had been the organizer, the host, the one ensuring everyone else was comfortable and happy while my own needs remained invisible. In every photo, I was smiling, but looking at them now, I could see the strain around my eyes, the forced quality of expressions that covered deeper exhaustion. I had been performing happiness while experiencing something closer to its opposite, and the performance had been so convincing that even I had believed it sometimes. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I would stop performing. I would stop pretending that relationships built on my giving and their taking satisfied me. I would stop prioritizing their comfort over my own well-being. I didn't yet know what this decision would mean in practical terms, but I knew it marked the beginning of something different. Whether that something would be better remained to be seen, but it couldn't possibly be worse than the slow emotional death I'd been experiencing. Change, when it finally came, arrived not with trumpet fanfare but with the quiet persistence of water wearing away stone. It began with small rebellions that felt enormous to me, letting a phone call go unanswered when I was reading, saying no to a request without extensive justification, spending $20 on a plant for my windowsill instead of adding it to the fund I kept for their emergencies. The plant, a small jade succulent with thick, waxy leaves, became my symbol of resistance. I placed it on the kitchen table where I ate my solitary meals, and its presence reminded me that I was someone worth nurturing, someone deserving of beauty in my environment. Mrs. Rodriguez, the superintendent's wife who had checked on me during my bout with the flu, noticed the plant during one of her occasional visits to fix my temperamental sink. "Very pretty," she said in her careful English, touching one of the leaves gently. "You have good hands for growing things." Her comment surprised me. I hadn't thought of myself as someone who grew things, who nurtured life beyond the people who took that nurturing for granted. But the jade plant was thriving under my care, its leaves growing plumper and more vibrant each week. Maybe I did have good hands for growing things. Maybe it was time to focus some of that care on helping myself flourish. That conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez led to others. I learned that she had immigrated from El Salvador 30 years ago, raised 4 children as a single mother, worked multiple jobs to send money back to elderly parents. Her story was different from mine but shared the common theme of women who gave until they had little left to give. "But you must keep something for yourself," she told me over coffee in her small apartment decorated with photographs of grandchildren I'd never met. "Children grow up, they make their own lives. You cannot live only for them forever." Her words were simple, obvious even, but they struck me with the force of revelation. I had been living only for my children for so long that I'd forgotten how to live for myself. I'd forgotten that I was a person separate from my role as their mother, with interests and dreams and needs that mattered independent of their approval. That summer, for the first time in years, I walked through Central Park not to meet someone or fulfill an obligation, but simply because I wanted to see the trees. I sat on a bench near the reservoir and watched joggers circle the path, couples walking hand in hand, children feeding ducks with their grandparents. The scene was ordinary, unremarkable, but it filled me with something I hadn't felt in months: contentment. No one needed anything from me in that moment. No one was waiting for money or advice or solutions to problems they could solve themselves. I was invisible in the best possible way, free to observe, to think, to exist without purpose beyond existing. Walking home that day, I passed a community center in East Harlem that advertised art classes for seniors. Something stirred in my chest, a flutter of interest I hadn't experienced in decades. I had loved drawing as a girl, before marriage and children and the relentless demands of survival had pushed creative expression into the category of luxury I couldn't afford. I stood outside the community center for 15 minutes, debating. The cost was minimal, $20 for an 8-week session, but the emotional cost felt higher. What if I was too old to start again? What if my hands, stiff with arthritis, couldn't hold a pencil steady? What if I was foolish for thinking I deserved to spend time on something that served no one but myself? I signed up anyway. The art class became my weekly anchor, 2 hours every Thursday evening when I belonged entirely to myself. The instructor, a patient woman named Carmen who spoke in both English and Spanish, encouraged us to draw whatever caught our interest. At first, I sketched simple objects: an apple, the view from my window, the jade plant that had started my small revolution. But as weeks passed, my subjects became more personal. I drew my hands, mapping the lines and spots that told the story of 7 decades of use. I drew Mrs. Rodriguez's smile, capturing the warmth that had been freely offered when my own family's warmth felt rationed. I drew memories, not the sanitized versions from family photographs, but the complicated truths of exhaustion, loneliness, and resilience. My fellow art students were mostly women, ranging in age from their 60s to their 80s. They shared stories during our break times, tales that echoed my own experiences of children who called only when they needed something, of savings depleted to fund adult children's poor decisions, of loneliness disguised as independence. "I raised 6 kids," said Elena, a woman my age whose hands were permanently stained with charcoal from her drawings. "Now they're all successful, all busy, all too important to call their mother unless they want something. I could die tomorrow and they'd find my body when the rent came due." Her words were bitter, but they rang with recognition. We were a support group disguised as an art class, women who had given everything to raise families only to discover that everything wasn't enough to secure their continued love once we were no longer useful. But the art classes also showed me something I'd forgotten: I was capable of learning new things, creating beautiful things, finding joy in activities that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. My drawings improved week by week, my confidence grew, and slowly, a version of myself I'd thought was lost forever began to emerge from underneath decades of maternal self-sacrifice. The breakthrough came in September, just before my 72nd birthday. Michael called with what had become his standard request: money for what he claimed was an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. This time, it was cryptocurrency again, a different digital currency that was supposedly on the verge of explosive growth. "I just need $3,000 to get started," he explained with the enthusiasm of someone who had never lost his own money on such ventures. "Within 6 months, it could be worth 10 times that much. Think about what that could mean for all of us." All of us. He still hadn't paid back the $5,000 I'd given him for his previous Bitcoin investment, but now he was positioning this new request as something that would benefit me too. The logic was familiar: he would risk my money on his behalf, and if the investment succeeded, we would all somehow share in the profits. If it failed, as his investments invariably did, only my money would be lost. $3,000. I calculated quickly in my head: that was 6 months of my art classes, a year of the small luxuries I'd begun allowing myself, the safety net I was trying to rebuild after decades of depletion. It was also money I simply didn't have, not without taking on debt or eliminating necessities from my already bare-bones budget. "Michael," I said carefully, "I don't have $3,000 to invest. My savings are gone, and I'm barely covering my own expenses." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note I'd never heard before, not disappointment or frustration, but something colder. "You always find money when we need it," he said. "If you don't want to help me succeed, just say so. Don't pretend you can't afford it." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. He was suggesting that I was lying about my financial situation, choosing not to help rather than being unable to help. After years of prioritizing his needs over my own security, he believed I was hoarding money that rightfully belonged to him. "I've given you thousands of dollars over the years," I said, my voice shaking. "Money I couldn't afford to lose, money I needed for my own future. I'm not pretending anything. I literally don't have $3,000. And I've paid you back plenty of times," he replied, which was simply false. "Family is supposed to help each other, Mom. If you can't count on family, who can you count on?" That question would haunt me for weeks afterward. If you can't count on family, who can you count on? The assumption underlying his question was that families should be countable, reliable, mutually supportive. But our families seemed to operate on a different principle. I could be counted on to give, they could be counted on to take, and any disruption to this pattern was evidence of my failure to understand what family meant. "I want to help," I said finally. "But I can't help with money I don't have." "Fine," he said, the words sharp as broken glass. "I'll figure it out myself. I always do." He hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me holding a dead phone and feeling like I'd failed some test I'd never known I was taking. The familiar weight of guilt settled on my shoulders, but underneath it, something newer and stronger was growing: anger. I was angry at his assumption that my resources were his resources. I was angry that years of sacrifice had created not gratitude but entitlement. I was angry that my honest explanation of financial limitation was treated as deceit or selfishness. But most of all, I was angry at myself for feeling guilty about prioritizing my own survival over his speculative investments. That evening, instead of calling him back to apologize or find some way to scrape together the money he demanded, I went to my art class. I drew my anger, gave it shape and color on paper. The result was abstract but powerful: jagged lines in dark charcoal, sharp angles that seemed to tear at the paper, spaces of white that felt like holes in my chest. "Strong emotion," Carmen observed, studying my drawing. "Sometimes we must make the pain visible before we can begin to heal it." Make the pain visible. I had spent so many years hiding my pain, minimizing it, pretending it didn't exist so as not to burden my children with my needs. But the pain was real, and it was mine, and maybe it deserved to be acknowledged rather than buried. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying the conversation with Michael, hearing the echo of his words and my own responses. How had we reached this point where my inability to fund his investments was treated as betrayal? When had my value as his mother become entirely tied to my usefulness as his financier? I thought about the years I'd spent working multiple jobs to support his education, the sacrifices Robert and I had made to ensure our children had opportunities we'd never had. Had we been wrong to shield them from financial struggle? Had our protection created adults who couldn't distinguish between what they wanted and what they needed, between financial help and financial dependency? These questions bothered me because they had no clear answers. I couldn't go back and raise my children differently, couldn't undo decades of patterns that had seemed loving at the time but had created relationships I no longer recognized. I could only decide how to move forward from where I was now. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than chosen. I would stop giving money to my adult children. Not out of spite or punishment, but out of necessity and self-preservation. I would prioritize my own financial security and emotional well-being over their convenience and comfort. I would be their mother in the ways that mattered, offering love, advice, emotional support, but I would no longer be their bank. The resolution was easier to make than to implement. Over the following weeks, I received several calls and messages from both Michael and Sarah, each with variations of familiar requests. Sarah needed help with her children's school expenses. Michael had found another investment opportunity. Each time, I explained that I could no longer provide financial assistance, that I was focused on securing my own retirement. Their reactions were predictably negative. Sarah accused me of becoming selfish in my old age. Michael suggested I was punishing him for being successful and ambitious. Neither seemed capable of understanding that my refusal to give money wasn't a rejection of them but an assertion of my own worth and needs. "This isn't like you, Mom," Sarah said during one particularly difficult conversation. "You've always been there for us. I don't understand why you're changing now." Always been there for you. The phrase bothered me because it reduced my entire identity to my availability for their needs. I had been there for them, financially and emotionally, but had they ever been there for me? When I was sick, struggling, lonely, or afraid, where had their support been? "I'm not changing," I told her. "I'm just recognizing that I have needs too, and I need to take care of myself." "But what about family?" she asked, and I could hear real confusion in her voice. "What about helping each other?" Family should help each other, I agreed. All of each other, not just in one direction. The conversation ended unsatisfactorily, as most of our conversations had begun to do. I was asking for something, mutual care, reciprocal concern, that seemed foreign to relationships built on my giving and their taking. They couldn't understand why I was no longer satisfied with arrangements that had worked perfectly well when working meant serving their interests rather than mine. As autumn progressed toward winter, the calls became less frequent. Without the possibility of financial assistance, my children seemingly had less reason to maintain regular contact. This should have hurt more than it did, but instead, it felt clarifying. I could see our relationships for what they had become: transactions disguised as affection, need disguised as love. The loneliness was real and sharp, but it was different from the loneliness I'd experienced while surrounded by family members who treated me as a resource rather than a person. At least now my solitude was honest, undisguised by the pretense of connection that masked emotional exploitation. But loneliness, I discovered, could also be freedom. Without the constant crisis management of my children's poor decisions, I had time to develop other relationships, explore other interests, invest in my own growth rather than their immediate gratification. The art classes had introduced me to women who understood the particular challenges of aging while maintaining dignity and independence. Through Elena, the woman whose hands were stained with charcoal, I joined a book club that met monthly at the library. Through Mrs. Rodriguez, I connected with other women in my building who were navigating similar challenges with adult children who viewed them as safety nets rather than people deserving of care and respect. These relationships were different from anything I'd experienced in years. They were mutual, reciprocal, based on shared interest and genuine affection rather than financial dependency or obligated contact. I began to rebuild my life around people who chose to spend time with me rather than people who contacted me when they needed something. The difference was subtle but profound. Conversations felt different when they arose from pleasure rather than purpose, when they were offered freely rather than extracted through guilt or manipulation. My 72nd birthday was approaching, and unlike previous years, I felt no expectation of calls or cards or belated acknowledgments. I had learned not to hope for what wasn't coming, not to organize my emotions around other people's potential actions. Instead, I made my own plans: dinner with Mrs. Rodriguez and Elena, a quiet celebration with people who knew me as something more than a source of money or solutions. But 3 days before my birthday, something happened that would change everything permanently. Something that would finally, decisively, end the pattern of disappointment and exploitation that had defined my relationships with my children for so many years. The morning started typically enough. I had developed a routine that anchored my days: coffee while reading the newspaper, a walk around the neighborhood if weather permitted, grocery shopping or errands as needed, then lunch and time devoted to whatever project interested me: drawing, reading, or corresponding with friends I'd reconnected with through various community activities. I was returning from the library, my arms full of books I'd selected for pure pleasure rather than self-improvement or obligation, when I noticed unusual activity on my street. A police car was parked outside my building, and 2 officers were standing near the entrance in conversation with Mr. Rodriguez, the building superintendent. My first thought was concern for my neighbors. Had someone been robbed? Was everyone safe? As I approached, one of the officers noticed me and checked something on a clipboard he was holding. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Eleanor Martinez?" My heart rate quickened despite my attempts to remain calm. "Yes, I am. Is everything all right? We need to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed. Could we step inside?" A complaint. The word echoed in my mind as I led them to my apartment, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the door. What complaint? Filed by whom? Had I unknowingly violated some regulation, failed to pay some bill or fee? The officers were professional but serious as they settled in my small living room, declining my offer of coffee but accepting seats on the couch I'd saved for years to buy. The younger officer took out a notebook while the older one explained the situation. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint alleging that you're experiencing some difficulties managing your daily affairs. The complainant expressed concern about your ability to maintain your residence and handle your financial responsibilities." I stared at them, trying to process words that didn't make sense. My apartment was clean, if modestly furnished. My bills were current, my responsibilities met. I had never been more mentally sharp or emotionally stable than I was at that moment, despite the family difficulties of recent months. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "Who made this complaint? What specific difficulties are you referring to?" The officers exchanged glances before the older one continued. "The complaint was filed by your son, Michael Martinez. He's requested a wellness check and has suggested that you may need assistance with what he termed financial decision-making and household management." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Michael had called the police on me. My son, whom I had supported financially and emotionally for decades, had reported me to authorities as someone incapable of caring for myself. The betrayal was so complete, so deliberately cruel, that I couldn't immediately form words to respond. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the younger officer asked, leaning forward with concern. I realized I was gripping the arm of my chair so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. "I'm fine," I managed. "I'm just shocked. What exactly did my son tell you?" They referred to their notes, reading from what was apparently Michael's statement. According to him, I had become increasingly erratic about money, refusing to help family members with reasonable requests while making impulsive purchases for myself. He claimed I had stopped maintaining my apartment properly and had become socially isolated in ways that concerned him for my well-being. Each allegation was technically based in fact but deliberately twisted to paint a picture of incompetence and decline. Yes, I had stopped giving money to family members, because I couldn't afford to continue doing so. Yes, I had made purchases for myself, books, art supplies, a plant, small things that brought me pleasure after years of denying myself even modest luxuries. Yes, I had become more selective about social interactions, because I was building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. "Officers," I said, working to keep my voice steady, "I'm happy to address each of these concerns. Would you like to see my bank statements to verify that I'm managing my finances responsibly? My apartment to confirm that I'm maintaining it appropriately? Would you like to speak with my neighbors, my friends, people who can attest to my mental and emotional well-being?" They spent the next hour methodically going through my apartment, examining my financial records, speaking with Mrs. Rodriguez and Elena, who happened to be visiting for coffee. By the end of their investigation, it was clear that Michael's complaint had no basis in reality. I was competent, independent, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. But the damage was done. My son had weaponized the system against me, using official channels to punish me for refusing to continue funding his lifestyle. He had tried to have me declared incompetent because I had finally learned to say no to his demands. The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculated precision. "Ma'am," the older officer said as they prepared to leave, "there's clearly no cause for concern here. However, I do want to mention that false complaints can sometimes be motivated by other factors. If you're experiencing any kind of harassment or manipulation from family members, there are resources available to help." After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment processing what had just happened. My son had tried to destroy my independence and autonomy because I had stopped being useful to him financially. He had been willing to risk having me declared incompetent, potentially stripped of my rights and freedoms, rather than accept my decision to prioritize my own well-being. This was who he had become. This was what our relationship meant to him. I was not his mother in any meaningful sense. I was a resource to be controlled, manipulated, and if necessary, declared unfit when I stopped being compliant. The phone rang several times that evening, Michael's name appearing on the caller ID. I didn't answer. What could he possibly say that would explain or excuse what he had done? What apology could bridge the chasm his betrayal had opened between us? By the next morning, he had left 4 voicemails, each more frustrated than the last. In the final message, his true feelings emerged clearly. "Mom, I know the police talked to you. I was worried about you, okay? You've been acting strange lately, and someone needed to check on you. If you weren't being so stubborn about helping family, none of this would have happened. Call me back so we can work this out. Someone needed to check on me." As if his concern for my well-being rather than revenge for my financial independence had motivated his actions. As if my refusal to continue funding his investments was evidence of mental decline rather than rational self-preservation. I deleted all the messages without returning his calls. Sarah called the next day, her voice tight with the kind of controlled anger she'd perfected as a teenager when she didn't get her way. "Mom, what's this I hear about you causing problems with Michael? He was just worried about you. You can't punish him for caring." She was reframing his attempt to have me declared incompetent as concern for my well-being, his cruel manipulation as loving attention. The gaslighting was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that I almost admired its efficiency. "Sarah," I said quietly, "your brother called the police and tried to have me investigated for being unable to care for myself. He filed false complaints that could have resulted in my losing my independence and my home. How is that caring?" "He wouldn't have done it if you weren't giving him reasons to worry," she replied without missing a beat. "You've been acting different, Mom. Selfish. Refusing to help when we need you. Maybe you do need someone to check on your decision-making." There it was. Sarah's position was clear. My refusal to continue being their financial resource was evidence that I needed outside intervention to correct my thinking. My choice to prioritize my own needs was pathological, deserving of official scrutiny and potential correction. "I won't be taking any more calls about this," I told her. "What Michael did was unforgivable, and your support of his actions tells me everything I need to know about how you see me." Mom, don't be dramatic, I hung up. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a piece of paper, composing the most difficult letter I'd ever written. It was addressed to both Michael and Sarah, but I knew I would be sending separate copies to ensure they both received it. Dear Michael and Sarah, I began, then stopped. How do you write a farewell to your own children? How do you explain that their actions have severed bonds that were supposed to be unbreakable? I started again, focusing on clarity rather than emotion, facts rather than feelings. Your recent actions have made it clear that our relationships are no longer sustainable or healthy. Michael, your attempt to have me investigated by police as incompetent was both false and cruel. Sarah, your support of his actions shows that you agree with his assessment of my decision-making abilities. Since you both believe I am incapable of managing my own affairs when I choose to prioritize my own well-being over your financial needs, I think it's best that we discontinue our relationship entirely. I will not be taking your calls, responding to your messages, or providing any further financial assistance. I wish you both well in your lives, but I will no longer be part of them. I signed it simply Mother and mailed both copies the next day. My 72nd birthday dawned clear and cold, with the kind of pristine winter light that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I woke without the familiar weight of expectation or disappointment, without wondering if my children would call or send cards or acknowledge the day in any way. For the first time in years, my birthday was entirely mine to shape. Mrs. Rodriguez had invited me for lunch, and Elena had suggested we celebrate with a visit to the Museum of Natural History, something neither of us had done in years despite living in the city that housed one of the world's great museums. The plan was simple, undemanding, focused on pleasure rather than obligation. But first, I had something to do. I had been avoiding it for months, but my birthday felt like the appropriate day for this particular ritual. I gathered all the family photographs I'd been unable to look at since the police visit, all the evidence of relationships that had existed more in my imagination than in reality. I didn't destroy them. Instead, I packed them carefully in a box with a letter explaining their contents and donated them to a local historical society that collected documentation of immigrant family experiences in New York. Someone, someday, might find value in these images of family gatherings and celebrations. But they would do so with the understanding that they were historical artifacts rather than personal treasures. The liberation was immediate and profound. My apartment felt different without those constant reminders of disappointment disguised as devotion, without the visual evidence of my failure to create the loving family I'd imagined I was building. The walls looked bare but not empty, ready for new pictures, new memories, new relationships that might actually sustain the people in them. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, as I was preparing to leave for my birthday celebration, the buzzer rang. I almost didn't answer it, thinking it might be a delivery for another tenant, but something made me press the intercom button. Eleanor? It's Michael. I'm downstairs. We need to talk. My heart rate spiked, then settled into determination. He had received my letter, and he had come to argue with it, to convince me that I was wrong to cut off contact, to manipulate me back into our previous pattern. But I was no longer the woman who could be manipulated. The police visit had burned away whatever remained of my willingness to prioritize his needs over my own well-being. Michael, I said into the intercom, I meant what I wrote in my letter. I don't want to see you or speak with you. Mom, please. 5 minutes. I drove all the way here. You drove all the way here. As if the distance he had traveled entitled him to my time and attention, as if his effort to reach me created an obligation for me to receive him. It was such a perfect example of the thinking that had characterized our relationship. His actions created obligations for me, his needs became my responsibilities, his presence demanded my accommodation. I'm not opening the door, Michael. Go home. I'm not leaving until you talk to me. There it was, the threat disguised as persistence, the manipulation dressed up as determination. He would force me to interact with him by refusing to leave, making his presence my problem to solve. The familiar pattern was so clear that I almost laughed at its predictability. Instead, I called Mrs. Rodriguez and explained the situation. Within 10 minutes, she had contacted her husband, who informed Michael that he was trespassing and would be removed by police if he didn't leave the premises immediately. The irony was perfect. The son who had called police on me was now being threatened with police action himself. He left without further incident, but not before shouting up at my 4th-floor window loud enough for the entire street to hear, "You're making a mistake, Mom. Family is all you have. You'll be sorry. Family is all you have." The words followed me as I walked to meet Mrs. Rodriguez and Elena, echoing in my head like a curse or a warning. Was he right? Had I just severed my connections to the only people who would ever matter in my life? Was biological family so irreplaceable that even toxic relationships were better than no relationships? The questions bothered me through lunch, through our museum visit, through the quiet celebration that my friends had organized with such care and thoughtfulness. Elena had brought a small cake from a Puerto Rican bakery, decorated with a single candle that she insisted I blow out while making a wish. Mrs. Rodriguez had wrapped a tiny succulent in colorful paper, a companion for the jade plant that had started my journey toward self-advocacy. Their gifts were thoughtful but modest, their attention genuine but undemanding. Neither woman needed anything from me except my company, neither expected me to solve their problems or fund their choices. They had chosen to celebrate my birthday because they enjoyed my presence, not because obligation or guilt demanded it. Walking home that evening, my small gifts tucked carefully in my purse, I realized that Michael was both right and wrong. Family was important, but family wasn't defined by biology alone. The women who had celebrated with me, who had chosen to spend their time and resources marking my birthday, who offered friendship without conditions or expectations, they had become my family in ways that mattered more than shared DNA. The family I had been born into had become strangers. The family I was choosing to build was teaching me what love looked like when it was freely given and gratefully received. That night, I called my wish from Elena's cake to mind. I had wished for peace, not happiness exactly, though happiness would be welcome, but peace. The deep, sustaining peace that comes from living according to your own values rather than others' expectations, from relationships that nourish rather than drain, from the knowledge that you are valued for who you are rather than what you provide. 3 weeks later, my wish began to be granted in ways I never could have imagined. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by certified mail that required my signature. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was panic. Had Michael somehow succeeded in having me declared incompetent despite the police investigation? Had my children found legal ways to override my decision to cut contact? I opened it with trembling hands and scanned the contents twice before the words made sense. It was not a legal action against me but notification of a legal action in my favor. Apparently, Mrs. Rodriguez had a cousin who worked as a paralegal for an elder advocacy organization, and she had mentioned my situation during a family gathering. The organization had reviewed the circumstances of Michael's false police complaint and had determined that it constituted elder abuse under New York state law. They were offering to represent me, free of charge, in filing a restraining order to prevent further harassment and potentially pursuing charges for filing false reports and attempted financial exploitation. I read the letter 3 times, hardly believing that what had felt like the most isolating experience of my life had actually connected me to people and resources I never knew existed. My story was not unique, the letter explained. Elder abuse by adult children was increasingly common, and there were legal protections available for people in my situation. The lawyer I spoke with the following week was a kind woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in elder advocacy cases. She listened to my story without judgment, asked detailed questions about the pattern of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation, and explained that what I had experienced fitted clear legal definitions of abuse. The good news, she told me, is that you recognized the pattern and extracted yourself before it escalated further. Many clients come to us after years of additional abuse, after their financial resources have been completely depleted. You protected yourself when you needed protection. Protected myself. I had never thought of my decision to stop giving money and cut contact as self-protection, but Patricia was right. I had recognized danger and responded appropriately, prioritizing my own safety over my children's comfort. For the first time since the police visit, I felt proud of my actions rather than guilty about them. The legal process was straightforward but emotionally complex. Filing the paperwork required documenting years of exploitation, manipulation, and harassment in clinical terms that stripped away the emotional confusion and made the pattern starkly visible. Seeing it written in legal language, the false police report, the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, made it impossible to minimize or excuse. Michael and Sarah were served with papers informing them of the restraining order and the potential charges. Neither contacted me directly, but I heard through Mrs. Rodriguez's network, which, I was learning, was more extensive and well-informed than any family communication system I'd ever experienced, that they were both furious and shocked. According to Elena, whose daughter worked in the same office building as Michael, he was telling colleagues that his ungrateful mother was trying to destroy his reputation over a simple misunderstanding. Sarah, through similar channels, was reportedly claiming that I was being manipulated by strangers who didn't understand our family dynamics. Their reactions confirmed everything Patricia had explained to me about abusers. They never accepted responsibility for their actions, always positioned themselves as the victims, and consistently blamed others, their targets, the system, outside influences, for consequences of their own behavior. But their anger and denial no longer affected me the way it once had. I was protected by law now, surrounded by advocates who understood the situation clearly, supported by friends who had chosen to care about my well-being without conditions. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came changes I couldn't have anticipated. The art class I'd been attending led to an invitation to display some of my drawings in a group show at the community center. The book club introduced me to authors and ideas that challenged and inspired me. Most significantly, Mrs. Rodriguez's extended network of friends and neighbors had essentially adopted me as family, including me in birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, and casual social events with the ease of long-standing affection. I was no longer lonely, no longer isolated, no longer struggling to maintain relationships that existed primarily to serve others' needs. Instead, I was embedded in a community of people who understood that relationships worked best when they were mutual, when everyone both gave and received care according to their abilities and circumstances. My finances, freed from the constant drain of other people's poor decisions, stabilized and even improved. I was able to put money back into savings, to plan for my own future rather than constantly managing other people's presents. The irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to give money to my children, I had secured my own financial independence and could now afford to be more generous with friends and causes that genuinely needed and appreciated support. In May, I received an unexpected call from someone I hadn't heard from in over 2 years, my grandson Marcus, Michael's oldest son. He was 24 and had recently graduated from college, and he had somehow obtained my phone number despite his father's instructions not to contact me. "Grandma," he said, and I could hear nervousness in his voice, "I heard about what happened with Dad and the police. I wanted you to know that I think what he did was wrong." The conversation that followed was painful but illuminating. Marcus had been aware of his father's financial dependence on me for years and had often felt uncomfortable with the constant requests for money. He had also noticed the way both his parents spoke about me when I wasn't present, with frustration, dismissal, and entitlement that he found disturbing. "They always talked about you like you owed them something," he told me. "Like your money was really their money that you were just holding for them. It never seemed right to me." Marcus's call opened a door I hadn't expected to find, the possibility that not all family relationships were irreparable, that some connections could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. He was young enough to recognize dysfunction when he saw it, old enough to make his own choices about relationships, and apparently wise enough to understand that love shouldn't be transactional. We began meeting monthly for coffee, conversations that felt entirely different from any family interactions I'd experienced in years. Marcus never asked for money, never brought his father's problems into our discussions, never treated me as anything other than a person he enjoyed knowing. He was curious about my art, interested in my friends, supportive of my new independence without needing to understand every detail of what had led to it. "You seem happier, Grandma," he told me during one of our visits. "Different. More like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. I was more like myself than I had been in decades, more comfortable in relationships that didn't require me to be anyone other than who I was, more confident in my own judgment and worth. The woman who had spent years apologizing for her needs had been replaced by someone who understood that her needs were valid and worthy of attention. Summer brought the first anniversary of my decision to stop giving money to my children, and I marked it with a small celebration. Mrs. Rodriguez, Elena, and several other friends joined me for dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try but had never felt I could afford. We toasted to independence, to friendship, to the courage required to choose self-respect over family approval. During dinner, Elena raised her glass and offered a toast that captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate, to Eleanor, who taught all of us that it's never too late to choose yourself first. Choose yourself first. Not exclusively, not selfishly, but first. Make sure your own foundation is solid before building supports for others. Ensure your own well-being before worrying about everyone else's comfort. Value your own peace above other people's convenience. These concepts had seemed impossible, even immoral, when I first began setting boundaries. I had been raised to believe that motherhood meant endless self-sacrifice, that love was measured by willingness to give until it hurt and then keep giving. But I had learned that relationships built on one person's depletion and another's entitlement weren't sustainable or healthy for anyone involved. My children had not become better people because I enabled their financial irresponsibility. My grandchildren had not benefited from watching their parents treat their grandmother as a renewable resource. My marriage had not been strengthened by my willingness to prioritize our children's immediate wants over our long-term security. Everyone in the family had been affected by dynamics that looked like love but functioned like exploitation. By choosing myself first, I had potentially offered all of them an opportunity to develop healthier relationships, with me, with each other, and with the concept of mutual responsibility. Whether they accepted that opportunity remained to be seen, but it was no longer my responsibility to manage their choices or cushion the consequences of their decisions. As autumn arrived again, bringing with it the approach of my 73rd birthday, I reflected on the year that had transformed my life so completely. 12 months earlier, I had been trapped in relationships that drained me, isolated by the very connections that were supposed to sustain me, financially insecure despite decades of work and saving. Now I was surrounded by people who chose my company rather than tolerating it, financially stable enough to plan for my future rather than just surviving the present, emotionally strong enough to maintain boundaries that protected my well-being without guilt or apology. The loneliness I had feared would destroy me if I lost my children's presence had been replaced by connections that nourished rather than depleted me. The art I had begun as a tentative experiment had become a central source of joy and purpose. My drawings had improved to the point where people genuinely admired them, and I had begun selling a few pieces at local community events. The money was modest, but it represented something profound, my ability to create value in the world through my own talents rather than my financial resources. My social circle had expanded to include women from the book club, neighbors from my building, volunteers from the community center where I had begun helping with their senior services program. These relationships were based on shared interests, mutual support, and genuine affection rather than obligation or need. I gave what I could offer happily and received what was offered freely, creating the kind of balanced exchange I had never experienced in family relationships. Most importantly, I had rediscovered my own worth as a person independent of my utility to others. I mattered not because I could solve problems or provide money, but because I was thoughtful, creative, kind, and interesting to be around. My company was valued, my opinions were respected, my presence was welcomed rather than taken for granted. The police visit that had seemed like such a devastating betrayal now felt like a bizarre gift. It had forced me to see my situation clearly, to recognize abuse that I had been minimizing and normalizing for years. It had connected me to legal advocates and community resources I never would have discovered otherwise. Most crucially, it had pushed me past the breaking point into action, compelling me to choose between continued exploitation and self-preservation. I chose self-preservation, and in doing so, discovered that I was worth preserving. My 73rd birthday was everything my 72nd had not been, anticipated with pleasure rather than dread, planned around my own preferences rather than others' availability, celebrated by people who were genuinely happy to mark another year of my life. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a surprise party at the community center, complete with decorations created by the art class and a cake baked by Elena's daughter. The room was full of people who had chosen to be there, who had taken time from their own lives to honor mine, who saw my birthday as an opportunity to express gratitude for my presence in their lives rather than an obligation to be minimally acknowledged. The contrast with previous years was stark and wonderful. During the party, Patricia Chen arrived unexpectedly with news that felt like the final resolution of my family crisis. The charges related to Michael's false police report had been resolved with a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to community service focused on elder abuse prevention. Both Michael and Sarah had been required to attend educational sessions about the legal definition of elder abuse and the consequences of filing false reports against elderly family members. I can't say whether they learned anything meaningful from the process, Patricia told me quietly, but they now understand that there are legal consequences for this kind of behavior. They're unlikely to target you again. Legal consequences. I thought about that phrase as the party wound down and friends began saying their goodbyes with hugs and promises to call soon. My children had needed legal intervention to understand that I was a person deserving of respect rather than a resource to be exploited. The relationships I had thought were built on love had required court orders to become minimally civil. This should have been heartbreaking, but instead it felt liberate. I no longer needed to wonder if my children loved me or simply loved what I could provide for them. The question had been answered definitively by their actions, and the answer had freed me to build relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. Sitting in my quiet apartment that evening, surrounded by birthday cards from friends and small gifts chosen with thoughtfulness rather than obligation, I understood that I had been reborn at 72. The woman who had spent decades disappearing into other people's needs had been replaced by someone who occupied her own life fully, who made choices based on her own values and interests, who understood that love without respect wasn't actually love at all. The view from my window looked the same as it had a year earlier, the same street, the same buildings, the same urban landscape of Queens. But everything had changed because I had changed. The subway sounds that once reminded me of isolation now spoke of connection to a city full of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles. The apartment that had felt like a prison of loneliness now felt like a sanctuary of peace and possibility. I had learned that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that love could be healthy as well as sacrificial, that boundaries were acts of self-respect rather than selfishness. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to choose a different way of living, even when that choice required leaving behind relationships and identities that had defined you for decades. The jade plant on my kitchen table had grown considerably over the past year, its thick leaves deeper green and more numerous than when I first brought it home as a tiny symbol of rebellion. Like me, it had thrived when given appropriate care and attention, when its basic needs were met without apology or guilt. Looking at it now, I understood that we had grown together into versions of ourselves that we were meant to be all along. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, another art class, another book club discussion, another coffee date with Marcus, another quiet evening with friends who chose my company because they enjoyed it. The future stretched before me not as a series of other people's crises to manage, but as my own life to live according to my own values and desires. I was 73 years old, financially stable, emotionally healthy, and surrounded by people who loved me without conditions or expectations. I had survived the destruction of relationships I thought were essential and discovered that I was strong enough to build better ones. I had faced the fear of abandonment and learned that chosen solitude was preferable to toxic connection. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my own life from people who had been slowly stealing it from me, one request and one boundary violation at a time. I had chosen myself first, and in doing so, had become someone worth choosing. The story I'm sharing with you today isn't just about family dysfunction or elder abuse, though those elements are certainly part of it. It's about the courage required to recognize when relationships have become toxic, even when those relationships are with people you love deeply. It's about the strength needed to prioritize your own well-being over others' convenience, to choose respect over familiarity, to value yourself enough to walk away from situations that diminish your worth as a person. I know that many of you listening to this story may recognize elements of your own relationships, your own struggles with adult children who view you as a resource rather than a person, your own confusion about where love ends and exploitation begins. If any of this feels familiar to you, if you've experienced the particular loneliness of being surrounded by family members who need you but don't seem to actually like you, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not wrong to want something different. You deserve relationships that nourish you as well as drain you. You deserve to have your own needs acknowledged and respected. You deserve to be valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. And you deserve to protect yourself from people who would exploit your love, even when those people share your DNA. The transformation I experienced didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without cost. Choosing self-respect over family approval meant accepting the loss of relationships that had defined me for decades. It meant facing fears of loneliness and abandonment that felt overwhelming at times. It meant rebuilding my identity from scratch at an age when most people assume their fundamental relationships are fixed and unchangeable. But the cost of continuing to enable exploitation was higher than the cost of ending it. The woman I became through choosing myself first was stronger, happier, and more genuinely loved than the woman I had been when I tried to buy love through endless giving. The relationships I built by being authentic were more satisfying than the relationships I had maintained by being useful. Your story may not be identical to mine, but if you're struggling with similar dynamics, I want you to know that change is possible at any age, that it's never too late to start valuing yourself appropriately, that chosen family can be more loving than biological family when biological family becomes dysfunctional. I also want you to know that there are resources available, legal advocates, support groups, counselors who specialize in family dysfunction and elder abuse. You don't have to navigate these challenges alone, and you don't have to accept treatment that diminishes your worth as a person just because it comes from family members. The community I found through Mrs. Rodriguez's network, through the art classes and book clubs and volunteer activities, has taught me that connection is possible at any stage of life when you're willing to be genuine about who you are and what you need. People are willing to care about you when you show them someone worth caring about, when you stop hiding your own needs and interests beneath layers of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing. I hope my story encourages you to examine your own relationships honestly, to consider whether the people in your life are adding to your well-being or subtracting from it, to think about whether you're giving from abundance or from depletion. Most importantly, I hope it reminds you that you matter, not just as a source of support for others, but as a person deserving of support, respect, and genuine affection. The police cars that arrived at my gate on my 72nd birthday felt like the end of my world, but they were actually the beginning of my real life. The betrayal that seemed designed to destroy me actually freed me to become who I was meant to be all along. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened, the catalyst you needed to make changes you didn't know you were brave enough to make. Have you ever experienced something similar to what I've shared today? Have you found yourself in relationships that demanded endless giving but offered little genuine care in return? Have you struggled with adult children who see you as a solution to their problems rather than a person deserving of their respect and affection? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if this story has resonated with you, if it's made you think about your own relationships or given you hope that change is possible, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these stories isn't easy, but knowing that they might help someone else recognize their own worth and find the courage to choose themselves first makes the vulnerability worthwhile. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of a community that believes everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or their relationship to the people who are supposed to love them most.